ನಿಮ್ಮ ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್ನ ಆಲ್ ರೌಂಡರ್.
ಹಾರ್ಪಿಕ್ ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್ ಕ್ಲೀನರ್. 2 ಹಳೆಯ ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್.
ಇದನ್ನು ಸ್ವಚ್ಛ ಮಾಡೋಣ ಹಳೆ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯಂತೆ. ಮತ್ತಿದನ್ನ ಹಾರ್ಪಿಕ್ ಆಲ್ ರೌಂಡರ್ ನಿಂದ ದುಬಾರಿ ಡಿಟರ್ಜೆಂಟ್ ನಿಂದ ಉಜ್ಜಿದೆ. ಆದ್ರೂ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹಳದಿತನ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಸ್ವಚ್ಛತೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿವೆ ಪಾಚಿ, ಅವಿತ ವೈರಸ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ಜರ್ಮ್ಸ್. ಮತ್ತು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾರ್ಪಿಕ್ ಕೊಲ್ಲುತ್ತೆ 99.9% ರೋಗಗಳನ್ನು ಮತ್ತು ಕೋವಿಡ್-19 ಕೊರೋನಾ ವೈರಸ್ ಅನ್ನು. ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್ನ ಆಲ್ ರೌಂಡರ್
ಹಾರ್ಪಿಕ್ ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್ ಕ್ಲೀನರ್.
ಹೊಸ ಬಾತ್ರೂಮ್ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳು.
ഞാനേ സെൻസസ് എടുക്കാൻ വന്നതാണേ.
അമ്മേ
സമ്പർക്കൊന്നും നടന്നില്ലല്ലോ.
മൂപ്പർക്ക് പയൊന്നും ഒരു താല്പര്യം ഇല്ല അക്കടെ.
ഞാൻ പോലീസില. ഈ ഉണ്ട മുളക് അങ്ങ് പൊട്ടിച്ച് പാലങ്ങോട്ട് പൊക്കി ഈ മുളക് ഒരൊറ്റ തൂപ്പ 100 മൈൽ സ്പീഡിൽ ഓടുക. 10 മുമ്പ് ഞാൻ ബിംബു
universities in Europe. Some of them are musicians and artists who we know have been targeted. They've been targeted killings of musicians and comedians in the past 2 weeks. And also researchers, professors, intellectuals, members of civil society who have their visas approved but can't leave the country at the moment. So we need to support them. And this is really the first immediate step of the negotiation that is happening and that needs to continue.
Just on that point, do we have a clear idea of the numbers of people, foreigners and Afghan nationals, that are still waiting around Kabul, around the airport to leave?
Now they're waiting at home, and they're waiting at home. There are thousands still on the list, again, approved to leave. So we need to focus on them in the first place. But then negotiations will need to continue beyond this population at under immediate risk, to also think about the women, the children left behind. So initially, the Taliban said that they would allow everyone to work. But recently, they've told women to stay at home, not to report to work. They're doing so only in a few sectors, for example, in the health sector. So most women right now are not allowed to work, and we see it already. We also saw on Sunday there was a very large meeting of the Ministry of Higher Education in a hall with hundreds and hundreds of men, but not one single woman. Before, that hall would have been filled 50% with women, also because the international community was there. So what we need to make sure is that that the UN keeps monitoring missions, a presence in Afghanistan, so that we keep monitoring the rights of women and children and youth left behind.
Now, following this pullout of US forces, the Taliban has already been speaking of independence, great independence. In your own opinion, what does the future look like in Afghanistan under the insurgents' rule?
Well, first of all, they speak of independence, but 75% of the Afghan economy, more or less, is supported by international aid. So the economy, and a former UN official was saying it, could collapse within weeks. Why? Because the IMF is withholding funds, because the US government is also withholding freezing access to the central bank reserves in Washington. So what we need is to be very careful. Negotiations can continue. Financial support should continue, and that doesn't mean recognizing the Taliban. It just means not putting the Afghan population under very strict economic conditions. We cannot have sanctions the way, for example, the US has done in Iran. It will just end up hurting the Afghan population more. Right now, Afghans don't have access to their salaries. There are hours of lines to withdraw money, and only very limited amounts from ATM machines. There's panic. There's inflation. 20% of basic food costs have risen by 20%. So right now we need to make sure that we can, first of all, support the Afghan economy, free up all these freezing of resources. Russia asked for it as well. We need to make sure that we do that. Otherwise, the health sector will crumble, the education sector will crumble, and institutions won't be there to govern the 40 million people. Then we need to ensure that there's enough access for humanitarian agencies on the ground, and make that access, again, conditional to the fact that we need to monitor what happens on the ground. And third, we need to have more coordination among foreign governments, among donors, to make sure that the UN assistance mission to Afghanistan is rethought, reinforced, but also to ensure that there's a common response for the future of the Afghan people.
Okay, Naseem Majidi from the Samuel Hall Research Centre. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, the Taliban has now tightened its grip on Afghanistan, a country which it now controls, except for the mountainous province of Panjshir, where a pocket of resistance stands against the insurgents. The group had previously claimed to have entered that province on social media, but the France 24 observers team geolocated those fighters to 1.7 kilometres south of the Panjshir border. The following footage shared on social media has been independently verified by our observers team.
In this video published on August 24, Ahmad Massoud, son of the legendary commander assassinated in 2001, addresses hundreds of people in Panjshir, the last anti-Taliban stronghold. He appears to be rallying the crowd to resist the Taliban, vowing to defend their land and freedom.
I wanted to thank you for your pure emotion and, God willing, with your help, with the help of the Mujahideen, with the help of the commanders, and most important, with the help of ulama of our country, we will revive the resistance and memory of Ahmad Shah Massoud.
Fahim Fetrat, an Afghan politician close to the National Resistance Front, spoke to France 24. He says they have 10,000 trained troops and the resources to resist an offensive for, quote, a long time.
Thousands of Mujahideen from the Panjshir region, as well as Afghan soldiers, special forces and police officers, have come to Panjshir after their towns were captured by the Taliban. They came with weapons and ammunition.
In this video, posted on August 25, the Taliban claim they are inside the Panjshir Valley, waiting for their leaders to give them an order to attack. But these fighters are about 2 kilometers south of the Panjshir border in neighboring Kapisa province. Still in the same area, these members of the Taliban say the Panjshiris should surrender peacefully. The video turns to show explosives, and a fighter threatens to blow up all the roads into the province. Negotiations have been ongoing between the Taliban and the National Resistance Front since August 26. They've agreed to a ceasefire until the talks are over.
OK, let's move on now. Alison Sargent joins me now to take us through how the newspapers have been marking the US's final withdrawal from Afghanistan. Alison, America's longest war may finally be over, but there are no real celebrations in the press.
Not at all, Thomas. The headlines from the U.S. papers are almost brutally dry this morning. U.S. forces leave Kabul, evacuation ends. That's the headline from the New York Times today. That actually is an image of a celebration on the paper's front page, but it is the Taliban that is celebrating after the departure of the final American airplane. The Washington Post, meanwhile, headlines simply, "America exits Afghanistan." It seems kind of intentional that they don't talk about the end of the war in their main headline. The Washington Post actually writes that the end of the forever war is more of an inflection point than an actual conclusion. The paper says the Biden administration now has to grapple continually with whether the Taliban is going to keep the promises that it made. USA Today also has a 3-word headline. They do talk about the end of America's longest war. Their Washington bureau chief writes that Operation Enduring Freedom, as it was first called, was launched at a moment of almost unprecedented national unity in the U.S., with the country reeling from 9/11. On Monday, though, the war finally ended, quote, not with celebration, but recrimination of all that has gone wrong.
And Alison, the British front pages, meanwhile, give us a sense of how badly things did go wrong.
Yeah, The Guardian sums it up here as chaos and bloodshed on their front page. That photo there shows the remains of a vehicle that was hit by a U.S. drone strike that's believed to have killed 7 Afghan children. You can really feel the frustration and the heartbreak in the papers today. The Independent is talking about war's bitter end. One of their former Afghanistan correspondents writes, quote, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 will be marked by humiliating defeat for the U.S., the UK, and their allies, and by gathering darkness for Afghans. Now, that is the common characterization of events that we're seeing, but the Financial Times does have an article defending the U.S. withdrawal. The writer Stephen Walt is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. He writes that it is wrong and unfair to blame the Biden administration for an embarrassing defeat. He argues that it took courage to end the war that everyone already recognized as a lost cause. And he says that it leaves the U.S. now in a better position to address more important challenges in the future, such as counterbalancing China or fighting climate change.
Now, Alison, that's just one opinion, but others are arguing that protecting Afghan civilians should remain the priority.
Yeah, the Washington Post in its editorial today is urging Biden to fight relentlessly to ensure that Afghan allies are given refuge. The paper writes in this editorial that it is a moral disaster that the U.S. has left thousands of Afghans behind. There's similar criticism coming from quite a few papers. A French paper, Le Figaro, headlines that Kabul has been abandoned to the Taliban. The paper calls it a defeat that could have been avoided. And And then a French paper on the other side of the political spectrum, Humanité, criticizes the U.S. for spending 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars and failing to produce any significant improvement in the lives of Afghans. Many in the U.S. are also really wondering sort of what this all adds up to. This cartoon from Benjamin Slingstad shows a parting message there from the U.S. You are welcome for the nation building. Clearly, though, judging by this image, no nation building has actually been done.
And finally, for this press review, papers are still now looking ahead to what comes next for Afghanistan.
Yeah, in that last cartoon, we saw the U.S. leaving. In this next one, we see who might be coming to take their place. This cartoon is by Bill Bramhall of the New York Daily News. We see there Air Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K Airlines, and Terror International. In addition to the threat from terror groups in Afghanistan, there's also the Taliban themselves. Liberation writes that the future under the Taliban is going to be a nightmare for Afghans. Their front page headline here is a play on words, not the jour d'après, which is the day after, but the jour d'après, which is the yoke after, a yoke as in a yoke of oppression. They spoke to residents of Kabul who say they feel abandoned by the international community. They say they fear the return of Taliban oppression. Women they spoke to said that they're afraid to go outside. The Taliban has said that they will respect women's rights, but many don't really understand any reason why they would magically change. That's the idea of this cartoon from Ann Telnis of the Washington Post. A fairy godmother, which seems to be a U.S. diplomat, perhaps, trying to transform this Taliban fighter. But much like the pumpkin on his head, he remains unchanged.
Alison Sargent with the press review. Thank you very much. Well, for more on what's happening with Afghanistan's economy since the Taliban took over in mid-August, I'm joined now by our business editor, Stephen Carroll. Stephen, what are the people in Afghanistan experiencing right now?
They're seeing the collapse of what's being described as a multi-billion-dollar war economy that had developed over the past 20 years that the US and its NATO allies were in Afghanistan. Today, we're seeing prices of everyday goods like lentils, vegetable oil, flour skyrocket in price. Some shoppers are seeing prices double. We're seeing average price rises, we think, around 20%. Of course, it's very difficult to get clear figures on that. Salaries, in many cases, have stopped being paid. Many banks have been closed since the Taliban took over. Those that are open have imposed controls on the orders of the Taliban of a maximum withdrawal of $200 per week. For people looking to withdraw money. The UN Food Programme is warning that 14 million people in Afghanistan are facing hunger as a result of this crisis. One economist from the Fitch Ratings agency, quoted by the Financial Times, said the country's economy could shrink by up to 20% in the next 2 years.
And Stephen, just what is causing all of this?
The important thing to know here is how much Afghanistan's economy depended on foreign aid. It accounted for more than 40% of the country's economy last year. Now, that's down from 100% in 2019, but grants still account for around 3/4 of government spending. Both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have suspended payments since the Taliban took over. That's cutting off a key source of that foreign aid income that they need to run the country. At the same time, the central bank's foreign currency reserves of around $9 billion have been frozen as well. Cash shipments of dollars that have been coming into the country for years now to help prop up the value of the local currency, they've stopped as well. That's led to a shortage of cash, one of the reasons why salaries aren't being paid. But it also has driven down the value of the Afghani. That means that imports are getting more expensive, and Afghanistan is a country that is largely dependent on imports. Among its top three are wheat, vegetable oil and oil. So those are products that immediately are going to see price rises as a result of the fact that the currency is much weaker.
Now, before this crisis, Stephen, just what was Afghanistan's economy like?
So this wartime economy, again, the reliance on foreign aid being the key part of it, but the money that came with the US presence in Afghanistan also went towards reconstruction in the country, and that drove quite strong growth rates, particularly through the 2000s. If we look at income per capita in Afghanistan since 2002, it has more than doubled, even if it still remains very low at a global level. But that dependence on aid is part of the economy's conundrum now. It also gets a huge source of its income from payments from foreign diaspora back to families in Afghanistan, remittance payments. That was worth 4% of GDP last year. That's now been cut off as well because services like Western Union, MoneyGram are no longer operating in the country. More broadly, despite that foreign investment that we've been talking about, Afghanistan's private sector remains relatively small. Agriculture is still the biggest source of employment. 44% of people in the country work in agriculture. Building and running a business remains very difficult in Afghanistan. It's ranked 173rd of 190 countries when it comes to ease of doing business, according to the World Bank. That's because of issues like insecurity, a lack of infrastructure, difficulty in accessing finance. Difficult to see how any of those issues could be resolved now. In the short term, the Taliban's easiest source of income, and particularly of foreign currency, is going to be opium. And that's exported for morphine and heroin production. The UN says that last year Afghanistan was the source of 85% of the world's opium. Longer term, the country does have natural resources like lithium that could be exploited, but that's something that's going to need a lot of investment before it yields any income.
Okay, Stephen Carroll, our business editor, thank you very much. It's time now for a quick break here on France 24, but there's more world news coming up after the break. In the next 30 minutes, we'll also be heading to Virginia, Texas and Washington, D.C. in today's Focus report to see what some US veterans of the Afghan war, their families and some politicians have been making of President Joe Biden's full pullout. Do stay with us. Live from Paris continues.
History has been marked by several violent and bloody revolutions.
Well, we often think about the big one from 1789, which profoundly transformed French society and inspired other countries around the world.
But there have been several modern uprisings as well that have given the French a somewhat rebellious reputation.
Join us as we unpack the legacy of these revolutions and explore what's left of France's revolutionary spirit.
French Connections Plus on France 24 and France24.com. Fake news. Noun. False stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media. At France 24, our job is to provide you with information that's been verified. We check sources, we check facts, we sort what is true from what is fake.
At the France 24 Observers, we verify photos and videos circulating online. If they're fake, we let you know and tell you how we spotted them.
In Fact or Fake, we dig into viral stories around Europe to shake out the truth from the trash.
Every day, the Info Migrants team scours social networks to fight fake news about the reality of migration.
France 24, news based on facts.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Here at France 24, we're taking a broad outlook by talking about the women who are reshaping our world.
En France 24 en español no tenemos temas vedados. Y eso se puede ver en televisión y en todas las plataformas que tenemos en Internet.
في فرنسا 24 لا ننسى ونحجز لكم أسبوعيا تذكرة عودة للمدن والمناطق التي كانت في قلب الأحداث قبل أن تدخل في طي النسيان.
Claro que tiene algo especial. Somos todos de distintos países
y trabajamos con todo el corazón para entregar información en el momento preciso.
أخبار سياسية واقتصادية وثقافية وأيضا رياضية بأعين خبراء رياضيين. هذه هي قناة France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. Worldviews. France 24 brings you all the news from hotspots around the world. In Africa, France. Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas. From Europe to Oceania, take a daily trip across borders to keep abreast of all the latest international news. Get exclusive updates from our correspondents around the globe. Our daily reports will take you to all four corners of the world. Every day, watch World Views on France 24 and France24.com.
Hello and a very warm welcome to those of you just joining us here on France 24. These are the latest world headlines at 9:30 a.m. Paris time. The US packs its diplomatic bags and puts its last soldiers on a final flight out of Afghanistan. Despite previous calls from its allies to extend evacuations, Washington pulls out of the Taliban-controlled country and in accordance with President Joe Biden's deadline. That departure triggers rounds of celebratory gunfire from the Taliban, with the insurgents stressing that Afghanistan has now gained complete independence. The UN still sounding the alarm bell, though, about a worrying humanitarian situation on the ground. We'll be speaking to France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent, who has just returned from Kabul. And it's lost much of its strength, but it's still causing concern. The downgraded tropical depression Ida moves inland over Mississippi, with the state governor in Louisiana saying the death toll from this natural disaster is set to rise considerably. Over 1 million people remain without power. Now, the picture behind me is one that's likely to go down in history. This green and grainy photograph released by the US Department of Defense shows Major General Christopher Donahue boarding a C-17 plane at Kabul airport on Monday, the last American soldier to leave Afghan soil. As that flight took off just before midnight local time, 2 decades of military presence in the country that began after the 9/11 terror attacks came to an end. A Taliban spokesperson has now said that this victory belongs to us. Earlier, we spoke to France 24's reporter Cyril Payen, who is one of the rare foreign journalists still covering this story on the ground. He had this to say from the tarmac of Kabul's international airport.
For now, it looks like the high command of the Taliban is really trying to push with this, let's say, a charm offensive towards the international community. We are not many foreigners here left in Kabul, but they really played the game, and they made some statements saying that we are just welcome. This is peace which is recovered because the invaders, the American left. This is what the statement here is. The problem for everybody here, and I'm mentioning first, of course, the Afghan population. The first question is now the security. There is no anymore of this anti-missile system were activated at the airport and by the American. Of course, the American left, and they have destroyed all they could take with them. So if there is any rocket attack by the Daesh, by the ISIS in Khorasan, the Central Asia franchise of the ISIS, if there is any bombing or the kamikaze coming here, there is no anymore this very sophisticated anti-missile or defense system or drone by the American. This is forever it for now. So this is in full charge of the Taliban. So this is the risks now. This rivalry between the Taliban and ISIS and Daesh here over the sovereignty and the control of Afghanistan. We don't know what is at stake, what's going to happen, and very quite millions of Afghans, I can tell you this morning, I just woke up with this Islamic Emirate, which is a new trip into the unknown for millions of people here.
Okay, it's time now for our à la carte segment. Today we're going to speak to France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent, who's just returned to Paris after a mission to report on the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan and the frantic race to get both civilians and foreigners out. Catherine, first of all, for many people watching, it will be hard to imagine the atmosphere in Kabul at such an historic time. Can you describe how it felt and what people there were telling you?
Hi there, Thomas. There were really two different atmospheres in Kabul. Incredible panic and desperation, of course. We've seen it around the international airport with those people queuing up to try and get out, cramming into the streets there despite all the warnings not to enter that zone. And then there was the city itself, which at first was eerily calm and quiet. But after a while, we did see people coming back out onto the streets, lots of them trying to buy food and things. And there are long lines of people outside the banks because a lot of them haven't been able to withdraw enough money. They're getting desperate. There are fewer women out on the streets as well. And people are waiting to see with bated breath, really, what happens next, because a lot of them will tell us off camera that they don't believe the Taliban's assurances, that they are going to be different this time, that they're going to respect human rights. You know, what is really telling what people tell you once the cameras stop when you're just having a one-to-one conversation. So one man said he was just very afraid and just going through the motions. He said that for him, the Taliban were the devil. Another man saying, you know, this is just the next round of this game we've been playing in Afghanistan for decades, this game of war and deadly violence. So feeling very cynical about the whole thing and saying, you know, this withdrawal of the Americans isn't changing anything. In fact, it's just a beginning of another cycle of violence. And, you know, just a lot of really despair, not a lot of optimism at all on the streets. People, hardly anyone I spoke to feeling bright about the future at all. Some of them trying to make do with what they've got, others just trying all avenues, of course, to try and leave.
Now, Catherine, during your time in Kabul, you encountered, of course, Taliban fighters around the city. Just how were they with you being a female journalist? And overall, how was it working in Afghanistan as a woman?
Well, it was quite something, I have to say. When I approached the Taliban with members of my team, Cyril Payan, you just saw there, and Vincent Soriol from RFI, when they saw me, they did seem surprised. It was unusual for them to be speaking with a woman. Now, I was modestly dressed, covered, wearing an abaya, so a very loose clothing, and covering my hair, not a burqa, but, you know, I made the decision, obviously, to dress like that. They'd asked women to cover up with at least the hijab, the hair covering. And then for security, you know, my team around me were telling me, you know, really should cover up. So despite those precautions, they were clearly very surprised to see a Western woman journalist. There were a few of us around, but still something of a novelty for these young men, a lot of them who'd come into Kabul from the country and had really never seen anything like that before. They would accept to answer my questions. Obviously, I kept, like, you know, a physical distance. I didn't want to make the situation any more tense at all. You do attract a lot of attention as a female journalist. Even on the streets, people would kind of stop and stare in a way that they wouldn't do with colleagues. I didn't feel that was hostile at all. And of course, it does give you access, being a woman, to speak to other women more easily in these very conservative Muslim countries. It does give you access, and it does put you, women you might interview, more at ease. So it's not necessarily a disadvantage. It's certainly, you don't go unnoticed, but you can get other access as well, being a woman journalist in these zones.
Catherine, you met with women's rights activists who were very afraid in Kabul. Are they, to your knowledge, still stuck in Afghanistan?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, that the women we interviewed and spoke to are still in Afghanistan. Now, I don't want to speak too much about their particular cases because we're trying to protect them for security reasons. I know that they were looking to try and leave the country. Obviously, evacuations of Afghan nationals at the moment via the air route are completely stopped, so that is not on the cards. These people and others have been collecting paperwork to try and make a good case. They're afraid. They're afraid for not only their lives, because they've seen the effects of bomb blasts in Kabul, suicide attacks by the Taliban, but also they're afraid for their way of life, which basically just changed overnight. They thought perhaps they had a few more months before the Taliban would take control of Kabul. They thought they had time to make plans. So one young woman was telling me, you know, she'd been studying, she had a job, she used to go out to cafes and see her friends, and now she hasn't been out of the house since the Taliban came into town. And actually, I think she and several other people like her are suffering from a kind of trauma or depression, because they are not eating, they're not sleeping, they're feeling very, very bleak about everything. And I want you to listen to an extract of one of the women we interviewed who was feeling that sense of despair.
The first day when Taliban came in Kabul, really I can't breathe, I couldn't breathe. All study, my all background, now it's like a grave. I had a good job in Ministry of Public Work. I had so much good pay, money for to help my family, but now I haven't.
So really heart-wrenching scenes, and a really intelligent, bright young woman who at the moment sees no way out physically and just staying in Afghanistan for her future. And you know, I just want to stress that she's not the only person by any means feeling like this. This is very common. I think there are a lot of people who haven't gone out on the streets since the Taliban came over, especially women, and they are feeling this despair, feeling this kind of mourning for their future. And I mean, who knows how many people there are like that, but there's a great sense of loss as the Taliban triumphed today in Kabul.
Okay, our senior reporter, Catherine Norris-Trent, thank you very much. Well, the US's war in Afghanistan has been the longest in its history, costing thousands of lives and over $2 trillion. Nearly 20 years after 9/11, Caris Garland takes a look back at how it all began.
The war in Afghanistan began in the shadow of the September 11 attacks. They were carried out by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, whose leader Osama bin Laden was sheltered by the Taliban in Afghanistan. On October 7, 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan.
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
The Taliban, who follow a hardline form of Islamic fundamentalism, came to power 5 years earlier with the support of the Pakistani government. While in power in Afghanistan, they banned music, art and education for women. They were soon routed by American forces and retreated to Pakistan or other bordering countries. In 2004, Hamid Karzai, a fierce enemy of the Taliban, became Afghanistan's new leader after winning the first democratic election in the country's history. But the Taliban hadn't disappeared. The group fought against the militias of Afghan warlords and formed a resistance, amassing billions of dollars by trafficking drugs. In the United States, Barack Obama succeeded George Bush as president and pledged to bring US forces in Afghanistan back home. Yet an escalation in violence left him no choice but to deploy more soldiers. By 2010, there were 100,000 US troops stationed there, along with 50,000 NATO soldiers.
The world cannot afford the price that will come due if Afghanistan slides back into chaos or al-Qaeda operates unchecked.
In May 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by the US military at his compound in Pakistan. For the coalition, this spelt the end of the mission, and troops began withdrawing in 2014. Some, however, stayed to oversee elections and support the Afghan army, which lacked resources and training. Meanwhile, the Taliban continued their attacks.
First, foreign armed forces must leave, then peace will be possible.
Almost 20 years of war comes at a heavy price. More than 3,500 coalition soldiers have died, about two-thirds of them Americans. Other casualties are not as well recorded, but researchers at Brown University put the number of civilians and militants killed at about 51,000 each, and estimate 69,000 Afghan forces have been killed.
An update now on the fifth strongest hurricane to have ever hit the US. After making landfall along the coast of Louisiana on Sunday, Ida quickly weakened and has since been downgraded to a tropical depression as it moves over Mississippi, where many communities are flooded. and where several roads are inaccessible. Emergency services in Louisiana are still picking through the debris, with the governor there warning that the death toll is set to climb considerably. So far, at least 2 people are confirmed dead, and over 1 million people are still without power. With more, here's France 24's Fraser Jackson.
Hurricane Ida may have been downgraded as it continues its push northeastwards, but the residents of Louisiana are taking stock of the damage left in its wake.
Things just start falling apart, blowing away on me. I ain't got a dry spot in the house. My roof gone. I lost all my clothes, my furniture, my appliances, everything. Right now, I got nothing.
Rubble, downed trees and power lines filled the streets of New Orleans, but the city has been spared the widespread flooding seen after Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
If there is a silver lining, and today it's kind of hard to see one, it is that our levee systems really did perform extremely well. There's been a preliminary damage assessment of levees today, people getting eyes on those levees. We don't believe there was a single levee anywhere now that actually breached, that failed.
Although the levees held, a couple did overflow. Storm surges and heavy rainfall have resulted in flooding in several areas, including La Place. Rescue efforts are underway both by water and air. Winds in excess of 200 kilometers an hour downed power cables across the state, resulting in over 1 million homes and businesses losing electricity. The damage has been so extensive that authorities say it could take weeks to repair the grid. Louisiana's hospitals were already brimming with COVID patients before Ida hit. The loss of electricity only adds even more pressure to an already under-strain health system.
You're watching live from Paris here on France 24. It's time now for a look at some other world news for you this hour. Days of non-stop rain has stranded hundreds of thousands of people in northeastern India, with some villages flooded by up to 2 meters of water. The downpours have seen several rivers burst their banks in the states of Assam and Bihar, with officials saying 400,000 people have already been moved to higher ground. The floodwaters are also threatening a nature reserve where the biggest number of one-horned rhinos live. Tourists have been fleeing en masse from one of California's most popular holiday resorts. This as the ferocious Caldor wildfire approaches Lake Tahoe, with the entire neighboring city of South Lake Tahoe ordered to evacuate. The threat of fire is so widespread that the US Forest Service announced on Monday that all national woodland in the Golden State will be closed until September the 17th. And there have been chaotic scenes at one iconic overpass over the River Thames in the British capital. Traffic on London Bridge was brought to a standstill by environmental activists from the Extinction Rebellion movement, who are pushing for urgent action by governments and businesses to limit climate change. Those protesters are targeting the capital's financial district located to the north side of that bridge during 2 weeks of demos. Algeria has become the last country in the world to end sales of one particular and highly toxic fuel at its pumps. That halt in sales has now prompted the UN's Environment Office to celebrate the official end of leaded petrol. Jean-Émile Jamin has more.
It's been hailed as the end of a toxic era. On Monday, the UN's environmental program declared that Algeria, the final country on Earth to use leaded petrol, exhausted its last stocks in July. It brings an end to the organization's 19-year campaign to rid the world of the poisonous substance.
Leaded fuel illustrates, in a nutshell, the kind of mistakes that humanity has been making at every level of our societies. The kind of mistakes that have brought us to the triple planetary crisis, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of biodiversity loss, and the crisis of pollution.
The dangers of lead have been well documented for many centuries, yet in the 1920s it was added to petrol for the first time in efforts to make cars more powerful. For 50 years, this was the norm until more developed nations started phasing it out. But by 2002, many countries were still using leaded petrol, prompting the UN to push ahead with their now successful offensive. As a result, scientists expect the world to save over $2.4 trillion annually, with the key benefit being a general improvement to global health.
Ending the use of leaded petrol will prevent more than 1 million premature deaths each year from heart disease, strokes and cancer.
While the latest news has been hailed as a climate victory, the UN says there's still a long way to go. The transport industry remains a massive concern, with over 1 billion new air-polluting vehicles set to hit the roads in the coming decades.
Now moving on far away from the desert battlefields of Afghanistan, in the corridors of power in Washington and in the homes of American veterans and the loved ones of those killed in the conflict, the mission and its end is still sparking debate. Should President Joe Biden have given the order to pull out US troops, and could the whole withdrawal and the evacuation operation have been better managed? Our bureau stateside has sent this, today's Focus report.
These bikers are all veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces. Some have served for 20 years, others less, but they are a band of brothers who've traded war zones for Virginia roads. James Sawyer is a former Marine who served 4 tours in Afghanistan. Grump is a bomb disposal expert who was seriously wounded in the Kapisa province. Like them, more than 800,000 U.S. troops have been deployed to Afghanistan over the past 20 years. Riding together reminds them of the camaraderie of the Army.
Yo, hey, this song started playing when we was riding, and the chorus just sets it off.
Since Joe Biden announced a full withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan back in April, Kabul and most of the country have fallen to the Taliban. For Sawyer, the withdrawal was a mistake, especially when it comes to fighting terrorism.
I don't think the job's ever going to be done. And you know, my concern, one of the reasons I did what I did for 20 years is to stop that and prevent it from spreading any further. So I definitely could see it gaining steam and taking over the country of Afghanistan and then pushing even outside of it.
He was already serving when terrorists attacked the U.S. on September 11th, 2001, a life-changing event for him, like for many Americans. He believes this war was unavoidable.
We had to do it. I mean, I think if we didn't, it would have been much worse. Even the attacks here on the United States, on September 11th and the other things that have happened, if we did not take action, potentially who knows what else could have happened. Are we ever going to stop everything? No. The loss of my friends and the loss of my Marines that I had over there, every single one of us knew exactly what we were getting into. Every single one of us knew the sacrifice. Do I wish they were here? Absolutely, I wish they were here. Do I ask myself many times, why not me? Yeah, all the time.
More than 2,300 U.S. military personnel have died in Afghanistan since the beginning of the war in 2001. Risa Debler is a Gold Star mother. Her only child, Staff Sergeant Clay Bowen, was killed in the line of duty.
He decided when he was in high school to go into the military. He told me one day, he said, I made a decision. I went to see the recruiter. I said, oh, okay. And then he chose infantry, and I'm thinking, why did you choose infantry?
Infantrymen engage in ground combat on foot, often on the front lines, making it one of the most exposed jobs in the military. This is where Bowen grew up, a room frozen in time.
In their dark red maroon beret, they all look so nice, and they hold themselves so proud. Oh yeah, I loved him in the uniform.
Bowen was killed in 2009 in Paktika province near the Pakistani border. He and his battalion were patrolling when their vehicle hit a roadside bomb. He was 29 years old. For his mother, it's hard to find meaning in a 20-year-long war.
I know so many people are angry about it. Why are we there? Nothing's changed. Everybody's got different opinions, and it's too bad that it happened. No one ever thought it would have gone on this long. 20 years, and so many killed. And I have said to myself, I never thought 9/11 would kill my son.
Bowen is buried at the Fort Sam Houston Cemetery near San Antonio. His mother visits his grave regularly. Despite her pain, she feels her son did his duty.
No, I don't think it was all for nothing. It's always been fight for your freedom, so that's about all I know, you know. It is what it is. It had to be done, at least going to war.
You've paid the highest price for your country?
I think he did, yes. And the people who loved him paid a high price, too.
While a majority of Americans were in favor of leaving Afghanistan, recent polls also show a majority criticizing Biden's handling of the pullout. In Congress, both Democrats and Republicans are now worried about the fate of Afghans who worked with the U.S. for years and were left behind.
America is going to debate this, our longest war. We're going to debate it for decades to come. We're going to talk about the mistakes, we're going to talk about the successes, but one thing we know to be true is that in the next couple of months, we have an opportunity to find some honor by doing the right thing and standing by people whose service and loyalty to this country cannot be questioned.
Democrat Jason Crow criticized the execution of the withdrawal, but insists it was the right decision.
Do I think it was too early? No, I supported the administration's decision to withdraw. We've been at war for 20 years in Afghanistan. I've been there twice in a combat capacity as a soldier. If there was a military solution to this, we would have found it a long time ago.
With no military or diplomatic presence after August 31st, the U.S. will have to count on the cooperation of the Taliban in order to live up to its commitment to get all Americans and Afghan allies out of Afghanistan.
Well, that's all from me for now, but do stay with us here on France 24. Our coverage of the latest international news continues.
Join us on the Europe Show here in Belgium, as well as in France. We've been talking to ministers and EU MPs to try to understand why there is so much opposition to the international free trade deals being agreed or negotiated in Brussels with other parts of the world. What will the impact be on the farming world, on the common agricultural policy, and on EU member states' economy? You'll know more of that on the Europe Show.
Talking Europe on France 24 and France24.com. Worldviews. France 24 brings you all the news from hotspots around the world. In Africa, France. Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas. From Europe to Oceania, take a daily trip across borders to keep abreast of all the latest international news. Get exclusive updates from our correspondents around the globe. Our daily reports will take you to all four corners of the world. Every day, watch World Views on France 24 and France24.com. is Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo a doomed city? It's in constant danger from the unpredictable eruptions of the most dangerous volcano on the planet and from the explosive gas oozing from beneath the waters of Lake Kivu.
Sasa niliona nyumba yangu gisi inaenda, nilisikia mimi nakosewa na nguvu.
The recent eruption has exposed the ineffectiveness of Goma's dilapidated volcano observatory, which is short of funds and resources.
Nous, on ne l'attendait pas immédiatement. On s'est trompé, ça c'est clair.
Journey into the depths of the earth with our report on France 24 and France24.com.
The U.S. flies its last military plane out of Afghanistan, marking the end of America's longest war. The Taliban now in total control of the country after a 20-year fight. The latest from our Cyril Payen inside Kabul airport coming up. The Taliban now has to deal with running the country, including kickstarting a struggling economy and creating a new government. On the way, a closer look at the challenges ahead. And as 1 million people are without electricity in the wake of Hurricane Ida, thousands more in Louisiana are facing weeks without power. The after effects of the hurricane hitting the southern United States hard. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this hour on France 24. I'm Jeannie Godula. Well, the very last U.S. soldier has now left Afghanistan. Major General Christopher Donahue boarded a C-17 plane at Kabul airport around midnight last night, local time. That departure puts an end to America's longest war, a 20-year occupation that began just after the September 11th attacks, cost over $2 trillion, and took more than 170,000 lives. But all those efforts were not enough to beat the Taliban. France 24's Cyril Payen is one of the few Western journalists in Afghanistan now. He sent us this report from inside the deserted airport in Kabul.
We have been walking for 2 kilometers inside this very military airport of Kabul. It's totally evacuated now by anyone but some dogs, actually, and the security of the Taliban. Here it's quite amazing that the American troops who just pulled out of the country a few hours ago have just left dozens of vehicles as shoppers. This American shopper is just left over. We can see lots of them around where I'm standing. And the Taliban are coming in and just checking, really basically checking what's going on and what do they have. It's really an amazing situation, quite surreal here where we are living. This is a no man's land here. We can see security by the Taliban everywhere, but it looks like they're just taking full charge of the airport, full charge of the country, and they are quite hospitable as for now. They were just inviting us to show that it's peace now. They have the full sovereignty of the country. It is said that also here very much at the tarmac, which is totally empty now of this military airport, empty of any planes. We see a lot of Humvees and armored cars roaming around. But it's said that the last hours of the night, when the Delta Force, the elite commandos from the American force, were the one who were organizing the last evacuation, the last plane landing, taking off. Sorry, it's said here among the Taliban people, and this is conditionally that I'm telling you that there were two of these elite members of the American force who did check hand with the Taliban security forces who were just moving in, just symbolically to shake hand to finish this 20 years war. But now I can tell you this is full of Taliban on the tarmac, so they have full sovereignty and control of the airport, full control of Kabul, full control of Afghanistan. We are heading for the creation of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan under control by the Taliban, and they will soon form a government, and there is no any of American soldiers here 20 years after they put step inside Afghanistan.
France 24's Cyril Payen there reporting from inside the international airport in Kabul that's now completely overtaken by the Taliban. Well, the U.S. deal with the Taliban to pull out of Afghanistan was originally made by former President Donald Trump. But it was one of the rare instances where both he and current President Joe Biden agreed. Biden did not reverse course when he took office, though he did push back the pullout date to now. He wanted more time to get U.S. forces out and evacuate U.S. civilians and others. Here's more from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
More than 123,000 people have been safely flown out of Afghanistan. That includes about 6,000 American citizens. This has been a massive military, diplomatic, and humanitarian undertaking, one of the most difficult in our nation's history, and an extraordinary feat of logistics and coordination under some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Going forward, any engagement with a Taliban-led government in Kabul will be driven by one thing only: our vital national interests. If we can work with a new Afghan government in a way that helps secure those interests, and in a way that brings greater stability to the country and region and protects the gains of the past 2 decades, we will do it. But we will not do it on the basis of trust or faith. Every step we take will be based not on what a Taliban-led government says, but what it does to live up to its commitments. The Taliban seeks international legitimacy and support. Our message is any legitimacy and any support will have to be earned.
The evacuation, of course, took a devastating turn 5 days ago when a suicide bomber outside the airport killed 13 U.S. soldiers and 180 Afghans. Solange Mougin takes a look back.
Over 800 Afghans amassed in the belly of a C-17 cargo jet, fleeing their country and Taliban rule. Thousands more swarming Hamid Karzai International Airport, desperately trying to escape. An American soldier giving water to dehydrated children, waiting and hoping to be evacuated. It's images like these that sent shockwaves around the world, as the United States undertook in just over a fortnight what President Biden called the largest airlift in U.S. history. In total, more than 123,000 people were evacuated, bringing an end to the U.S.'s 20-year war in Afghanistan. The final withdrawal began suddenly, August 15th, when the Taliban entered the capital and took in just a couple of days Kabul. Helicopters in a mad dash began evacuating the U.S. embassy. It would later temporarily be relocated within the airport, a final strip of land under U.S. control. Caught off guard by the Taliban's advance, thousands of Afghans surged on the airport. Troop presence was bolstered to control the crowds.
We're here because we want to leave. We've left our home without food.
Taliban will not allow us to study, build our future, and especially for girls and women. That's why I want to leave my country.
Many waited hours and days to show visas and get past the armored gates of the airport. The Taliban, working with U.S. forces, refused to extend the August 31st deadline. Already fearing too many skilled workers had fled. At a steady clip, military planes from a breadth of nations departed Kabul, day and night. On August 23rd, over 20,000 people were airlifted. The following day, nearly just as many. But the already mammoth evacuation took a harrowing turn on August 26th, when a suicide bomber affiliated with the regional Islamic State group killed 13 U.S. soldiers and 180 Afghans. The international community and the Taliban, working hand in hand to conclude the withdrawal, condemned the attack. The ever-dangerous exit mission picked back up again within hours, with nearly 7,000 people airlifted the following day, until August 30th. Just a minute before midnight local time, the last group of American soldiers departed.
So Afghanistan is now controlled by the Taliban again. The militant group, though, has to deal with a rapidly failing economy and uncertainty over just how it will form a government with so much infighting within its factions. Pakistan's foreign minister, though, now says Afghanistan will form a new government within days. Mario Sofos has more on the challenges ahead.
When the Taliban took control of Afghanistan on August 15th, the country's banking system came to a standstill. Many banks are closed and cash machines aren't distributing money. With the currency plummeting and food prices rising, People are becoming more desperate by the day. Afghanistan's vulnerable economy has depended greatly on aid. According to the World Bank, about 40% of its GDP came from international aid. Since the Taliban's takeover, Western nations, including the US and Germany, have stopped supplying foreign aid to the country. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have suspended payments too. On Saturday, the Taliban said that banks had been ordered to reopen and that a weekly withdrawal limit of $200 had been imposed. Despite this, banks remain closed. As well as having an economic crisis to deal with, the Taliban are also facing a political one. Its timeline for forming a government remains unclear, though the movement's main spokesperson has said that an announcement would come within weeks. The Taliban's main obstacle in forming a government are the various rival factions within the group. Senior leaders know that for any government to survive, they will need foreign recognition and that they would benefit from including different political parties and players. Hardline militants, on the other hand, are unlikely to want to play ball with the international community. In this way, consolidating power within the Taliban could deepen divisions that have existed for years.
Let's focus now on another big story for you today, the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. More than 1 million people were left without electricity, including most of the residents of New Orleans. Thousands in the U.S. state of Louisiana are now facing the possibility of weeks without power. Ida was the 5th strongest hurricane to ever hit the U.S. Hundreds of people called in for help to be rescued. At least 3 have died, but the final death toll could be much worse. Eric Pape told us more from outside the Louisiana town of Baton Rouge.
So the storm has passed, but the implications of its damage are sinking in. Over here you have people who have been waiting in line for a very long time. They're getting gas. They're getting very stressed out. There's a lot of arguing here. And a lot of people are talking about getting out of town, moving away, going to Texas to be with relatives. We talked to some people about why they're leaving.
Yeah, we live over here, but we're flooding there. We're to our knees.
The winds are gone, but the power is supposed to be out for possibly 3 weeks. Nobody really knows. We're here in 3 weeks before power, so we're trying to get some gas and get out of here.
They told us that it was sort of like Katrina, and since it's like Katrina, it's going to be a while since our power gets back on, like weeks, even months, and I'm worried about my son, and my 2 dogs.
In the last few minutes, this gas station over here ran out of gas. People who filled up are leaving to places like Texas and elsewhere, but it raises a question about those who are still here and can't fill up. What are they going to do now?
Hurricane Ida, just another sign of extreme weather conditions that have been on the rise due to climate change. One global measure, though, has been trying to fight that in some way. The sale of leaded gasoline as opposed to unleaded has now been stopped all over the world. Algeria was the very last country to stop selling the highly toxic fuel, as Jean-Emile Jamin reports.
It's been hailed as the end of a toxic era. On Monday, the UN's environmental program declared that Algeria, the final country on Earth to use leaded petrol, exhausted its last stocks in July. It brings an end to the organization's 19-year campaign to rid the world of the poisonous substance.
Leaded fuel illustrates, in a nutshell, the kind of mistakes that humanity has been making at every level of our societies. The kind of mistakes that have brought us to the triple planetary crisis, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of biodiversity loss, and the crisis of pollution.
The dangers of lead have been well documented for many centuries. Yet in the 1920s, it was added to petrol for the first time in efforts to make cars more powerful. For 50 years, this was the norm until more developed nations started phasing it out. But by 2002, many countries were still using leaded petrol, prompting the UN to push ahead with their now successful offensive. As a result, scientists expect the world to save over $2.4 trillion annually, with the key benefit being a general improvement to global health.
ending the use of leaded petrol will prevent more than 1 million premature deaths each year from heart disease, strokes, and cancer.
While the latest news has been hailed as a climate victory, the UN says there's still a long way to go. The transport industry remains a massive concern, with over 1 billion new air-polluting vehicles set to hit the roads in the coming decades.
And finally, if you have a kid at home a little too into video games, this story might interest you. China has just banned children from playing online games for more than 3 hours a week. Starting tomorrow, kids in China can only play video games anywhere in the world. We'll leave you with that. You are watching France 24. Stay with us. There's a lot more to come.